is entitled, the presentation is entitled Financial Returns for Weeds and Disease Management Inputs in Peanuts in Southern Ghana. And our speaker is Stephen Arthur. And Stephen, we would just ask that as you go through here, that you'll share turn your video on with us as well. There you go. Excellent.
Yeah, great. Okay, so please, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. All right, so my name is Stephen Arthur, and my work is on financial returns from weed and disease management practices in peanut in southern Ghana. And this will be the outline of my presentation. So peanut is cultivated mainly by peasant farmers in Ghana, and yield losses of up to about 80% has been recorded due to the interference of weeds. Manual weeding, which still remains the most applied way of removing weeds from peanut fields, is very effective, but however, this is time consuming, it's costly, it's labor intensive, and labor is often not available, especially during the peak of seasons when other crops are being cultivated. Also, diseases cause a lot of yield losses in peanut production in Ghana, and diseases are known to cause up to about 50% of the yield losses in Ghana. Paramount among these diseases in Ghana are early and late leaf spot disease, the rosette disease, as well as the rust disease. And so significant tests and experiments have been done and recommendations have been given. Some of these recommendations that have been given are through the work that Abdullah and his colleagues did, as well as that which Arthur and his colleagues did in 2016. However, these recommendations that have been given do not really compare the financial contributions of the recommendations to the farmer's pocket. And so we don't know how much money they bring on table. And so this work was set up to actually determine the interaction between pest management practices on weed, disease incidence and severity, and on pod yield, and also to estimate the financial returns as influenced by the pest management practices, and also to determine the relationship between weed, disease incidence and severity, pod yield, and economic returns. The work was carried out in Crop Research Institute's Kwadaso and Fumiswa Station, and also on farmer fields in Nigeria in 2015 and 2016. It was a 2x8 factorial experiment, which was laid in RCBD with 4 replications. 2 varieties were used, but each experiment had a different variety, and the cultivars or variety that was used were Yenyawoso, which is an improved variety or cultivar, and Konkoma, which is a local farmer's cultivar. These were planted at spacing of 50 centimeters between rows and 20 centimeters within rows. There were 2 factors, and the first factor was the fungicide treatment, which had 2 levels. We had one that had no fungicide application, and then the other level was one with the fungicide application, which was done 4 weeks after planting and 6 weeks after planting. In 2015, tebuconazole was applied, and in 2016, it was azoxystrobin and difluconazole, which were applied. The change in fungicide was basically due to availability on the market. For weed management, we had 8 levels. We had one that had no weed control. We had the conventional manual weeding at 3 weeks and 6 weeks. We had the application of pre-emergence herbicide, post-emergence herbicide, the follow-up manual weeding on pre-emergence herbicide or post-emergence herbicide. We had a combination of the pre-emergence herbicide and post-emergence herbicide, as well as the pre-emergence and post-emergence herbicide combined and followed by manual weeding. The pre-emergence herbicide used here was metolachlor, and the post-emergence herbicide was imazethepal. For the leaf spot incidence, it was measured as the percentage of peanut plants that have lesions within the 5 central rows. And then for the severity, it was scored on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 showed a plant that had no lesions on them, and 5 depicted a plant that was severely infected with more than 70% of its leaves showing lesions. And for analysis purpose, the midpoint of the percentages attached to them were used for analysis. For the economic returns, it was calculated as the gross returns minus the production cost. And production cost included all the cost of production except the cost of acquiring a land or renting a land. For gross returns, it was calculated as $1.2 per kilogram, and this was calculated on 65% shelling percentage on the pod yield. For data analysis, the data was analyzed using SAS, and means were separated using the Fisher's protected LSD at 5%. Person's correlation coefficient at 5% was also used to determine the relationships between the parameters that were measured. For the results, I must say that there were no significant interactions between the weed management and fungicide treatment on the leaf spot disease incidence, but for the severity of the leaf spot, there were significant interactions. And looking at the table I have here, you would see that whenever the fungicides were applied on the farmer variety, which is the Konkoma variety, the leaf spot severity was low as compared to that when it wasn't applied on the Konkoma variety. However, looking at where there was no weed management practice put in place and where the pre-emergence herbicides were sprayed, the fungicide, the severity of leaf spot was high. And this is because these two did not do a very good job at controlling weeds at the stages when the fungicides were applied. And so they obstructed the percolation of fungicide sprayed into the canopy. And so the fungicide could not penetrate into the canopies of the peanut. However, with the Yenyawoso variety, which is the improved variety, the fungicide, the severity of leaf spot was quite low. Also, with the other parameters, there were no significant interactions between them, and so the main factors are presented here. And looking at the influence of weed management on weed biomass, it is seen here that whenever the pre-emergence herbicide or post-emergence herbicide were followed by manual weeding, the weed biomass, which depicts the growth, was low, both for the Yenyawoso cultivar and the Konkoma cultivar. However, where there were no weed management practices put in place and where pre-emergence herbicides were sprayed alone, the weed growth was quite high in the for both varieties. However, the weed growth in the Konkoma variety was a bit higher than that of the Yenyawoso variety, basically because the Yenyawoso is a bit of a creeping variety than the Konkoma, which is erect and it allows percolation, sunlight to move in there, and weeds would obviously perform. Now, looking at the influence of fungicide treatment on pod yield and financial returns, it was also seen that for the susceptible variety, which is the Konkoma, whenever the fungicides were applied, pod yield shot up and it was significantly more than when it wasn't applied, and this translated into economic returns. However, with the improved variety, there was just a little bit of improvement in the pod yield over when there was no fungicide applied. However, this did not translate into economic yield, as the economic yield of that which fungicides were not applied was a bit more than that which fungicides were applied, basically because the cost of acquiring fungicides and the cost of application increased the production cost, and this resulted in the low economic returns. For the influence of weed management on pod yield and financial returns, it was realized that whenever the pre-emergence herbicides or post-emergence herbicides were followed by manual weeding, yields were higher in both varieties or cultivars, and it was similar to when the conventional manual weeding was done twice. However, this did not translate into the financial returns for the conventional manual weeding, as the second follow-up weeding increased the cost of production and so reduced the financial returns as compared to that of the pre-emergence or post-emergence followed by manual weeding. For the relationships between the parameters measured, it was seen that there was a positive correlation between pod yield and financial returns, which is expected because if you have more pod yield, obviously your financial returns will be higher. Also, for pod yield and leaf spot severity, there was a negative correlation between them, especially for the Konkoma variety. And this is also true because if you don't control the leaf spot disease, obviously it will result in low yields. And a similar situation was seen for wheat growth, which is also true because if you don't, if weeds are not controlled in our plot, it would obviously result in pod reduction in pod yield. Financial returns and leaf spot also had negative correlations, and this is also true because once you have leaf spot, it would obviously result in a lower pod yield, which would obviously affect the financial returns. And a similar thing can be said about wheat biomass as well. So in conclusion, what we are saying is that there was a significant interaction between weed management and fungicide program for leaf spot disease severity, but there was none for the weed growth, pod yield, and economic returns. For the herbicides and manual weeding combinations, we saw that that could increase the returns financially, and also the results demonstrate that financial value is heightened, especially when fungicides are applied on local cultivars that are susceptible to the diseases. So with our recommendations, what we are saying here is that smallholder farmers should actually do integrated crop weed management practices where they employ disease-resistant or disease-resistant cultivars and add manual weeding to it, which would improve their economic returns. And also for much economic returns, fungicides should only be applied on susceptible cultivars. We are also advocating that a broader application of fungicides and herbicides should be done on smallholder farmers field to actually see what will happen in their context, since results achieved in this experiment is way higher than that seen in farmer fields. I want to acknowledge the financial support of the USAID Feed the Future PML project and my advisors. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this. And we have time for questions for our speaker. And right now we do have one question that's been asked. And that actually we have two questions. And this is from Dr. Barry Tillman. And the first question is, if needed, are herbicides or fungicides available to growers in Ghana? If they need to use the fungicides or want to, do they have access to does a typical grower have access to the fungicides or herbicides?
Okay, great. So the question is availability of the fungicides and herbicides, and yes, they are available.
Okay. The follow-up question says, what equipment will farmers use to apply the herbicides and fungicides?
Okay, so the question is, what equipment would farmers use to apply the fungicides and herbicides? And that is a backpack knapsack sprayer.
Okay. Do we have other questions from the audience? One question that's come is that where fungicides were not shown to be profitable in use, was it because of low disease pressure, or were they not profitable because there were other factors that restricted yield outside of what the disease may or may not have done? Okay, great. So now the question here, if I understand very well, is that were there other factors that efficacy of the fungicide, or it was really that the crop did not yield to the disease? And the answer is that both varieties and experiments were done concurrently. And so the environmental conditions were similar. The only issue here is that the improved variety is not susceptible to the disease. And so it's not profitable controlling something that does not affect the crop. And it means that we can eliminate that with the improved variety, but for the susceptible variety,
we've got to use the fungicide to control so that we can have maximum financial returns.
Excellent. And we have one last question, looks like. The question is from Dr. Abraham Fulmer. He says that pre-herbicides plus post-herbicides plus hand weeding resulted in more weed biomass and less yield than a single herbicide application. This seems to be somewhat contradictory. What is your explanation of this?
Okay, so let me go back to that. Weed biomass. Okay, so this is what he is trying to say. And if you look at the weed biomass here, you realize that this is lower. 34 is quite lower than the others. That is when the pre-emergence and post-emergence were followed by manual weeding, and that is low.
Okay. All right, that concludes the time we have for questions. And I'd like to thank our speaker very much for a wonderful presentation, and thank you. And we'll move on to the next one, next speaker.